Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this pre-budget webinar on the critical state of India's export economy. India's journey towards becoming a global economic powerhouse hinges heavily on the strength of our exports. With global trade dynamics evolving and India is striving to become a 5 trillion economy, this is a critical moment to assess the challenges and opportunities in our export sector. Today's conversation is about creating a wish list, a set of actionable ideas that policymakers can consider to enhance India's position in global trade. Our panel of industry experts will share insights, highlight pain points, and propose solutions that could shape the future path of our exports. Today we have Mr. Ajay Sahai, DG and CEO of FIEO, Ajay Srivastava, founder GTRI, Nisha Taneja, professor ICRIER, and Manasvi Srivastava, independent trade expert. Welcome everyone.
Thank you.
So starting with you, Mr. Sahai, in your view, what is the current state of India's export sector? How it is faring at the moment?
Looking into the global headwinds, I feel that we are doing pretty well in exports, more so in the services sector, not so much in the goods sector. But in the goods sectors also, if you're talking about the technology and knowledge-driven sector of export, their growth are quite promising. In some of the employment-intensive sectors, definitely we are struggling. But the good news is that at least in the apparel sector, we have bounced back. And we expect that we may be ending this financial year with export of around 820 to $25 billion of goods and services exports as compared to $778 which we recorded in last financial year. Uh, I think that's a good one, but the main concern will be remaining with the labor-intensive sectors of exports.
Thank you for your insights, Mr. Sahai. Uh, Nisha Taneja, adding to what Mr. Sahai has already spoken about, could you share your thoughts on how his thoughts align with your observations on the state of country's exports?
Uh, uh, yes, I think even though exports are done well, I think this difference between goods and services is something that all of us need to take note of. So basically, during April to November, goods exports have actually increased by only 2.2%, whereas services have increased by 14.5%. So that's a huge difference. So what we can say is that basically our exports are getting driven by services. And while we can celebrate that, I think there is a lot that we can do on the goods side. But maybe there are three things that one can keep in mind. One is that there are huge technological changes right now, and so instead of also so this and this so the speed of adaptation to technology is really going to be going to lie at the core of our competitiveness. Secondly, we need to expand our exports, and instead of focusing on curbing imports, uh, I think a better thing to do would be to focus on expanding exports. And what we also need to keep in mind is that 88% of our imports are actually constituted by raw materials, capital goods, and intermediate goods, all of which are actually required. So, yeah. And thirdly, if we are concerned about import dependence on any items, then what we should do is consider inviting FDI. We shouldn't shy away from inviting FDI from China, for instance, uh, and have a proper strategy in place to build guardrails around it. Now, coming back to the trends in goods and services, it is true that goods are all getting more and more servicized because more and more of service component is coming into manufacturing exports, and maybe that's good news for us because we can build our capabilities around that. Um, and like Dr. Sahai said, uh, there is a very distinct shift towards medium and high technology goods. And but here again, there is a huge untapped potential. For instance, we're very happy that our smartphone exports are $15 billion, but the world demand for just the single item is $300 billion. So that's the kind of untapped potential that there is, even in a sector like that. Coming to services, um, we are doing really well in exports of digitally delivered uh, services, and in fact, we're ranked fourth globally, behind only US, UK, and Ireland. But China is not far behind; it ranks number six. Uh, so we are doing well in services, but maybe software has always been our traditional core strength. What has actually caught the attention of everyone in recent years is the growth of the global capability centers, and that's really rapid strides and is contributing in a huge way to our services exports. So, and these GCC centers are really, what we're doing is we're attracting uh, global firms to come and set up their base here and take care of global digital operations, whether it's related to finance or it is related to HR or even R&D or innovation. So that's the kind of range that these global capability centers are actually covering. And one good example is health, where what we're doing is we are doing the GCCs are doing clinical trials. They're developing and supporting telemedicine platforms. They're getting into health analytics, where they're trying to leverage big data and AI for improved patient outcomes. And these are also becoming centers for R&D. So just one sector is covering this whole range. There are other sectors also which are not done too well, like medical tourism. We think there is a lot of scope, but its over dependence on Bangladesh has come to the fore because 70% of our medical tourist arrivals are from Bangladesh alone, and that's taken a major hit. So we need to look at it more holistically and include more services if we want to expand it further.
Okay, okay, all right. Uh, that's an interesting point, ma'am. Mr. Ajay, building on that, what is your take on the pace and direction of the country's export?
Sharik, export sector is growing and it's changing also quietly at a very fine level. So if I look at the past 5 years data, merchandise exports have grown at the rate of 5.8% and services at the rate of 10.5% annual growth in the past 5 years. Now, if this growth rate continues for another 5 years, then our services will overtake goods in 2030. So, and we have not been talking enough about the services, focusing only on IT services, but there are many other big categories of the services which are slated to take over IT services like other business services. So, that's one big change that we are noticing. It will become very prominent. That's number one. Number two, if I look at the past 20 years data, then our export basket is transforming. Structural changes are happening. For example, many of the product groups which were very high at the global level, we were nowhere. For example, machinery or computers. Our share 20 years back was 3.9% in global trade, in our export basket. Now that share has increased to 6.9%, 3.9 to 6.9%, almost doubled. Electronics, the share of electronics in India's global exports basket was 3%. Now it's 7.9%. Automobile, 2.7% to 4.8%. So the sectors which were important globally, but we were not doing good, they are gaining prominence in the past 20 years. Their share in India's export basket is increasing, but there are traditional sectors like uh, Sahai sir has said, the textiles. Its share was 21.1% 20 years back. Now it's only 8% India's export basket. So this share is coming down. We have to look into the reasons how we can increase this. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ajay. Uh, now let me turn to Mr. Manasvi. Uh, sir, how would you like to expand on the insights shared so far on the state of India's export?
Well, I'd say partly agree, and partly I'd like to add on to that. It's always good to have a diverse panel because you bring multiple views on the table. I would not be very excited about the export growth rate, obviously, because in the previous year we had a decrease. And if you are if you are having an increase over an year which had a decrease, it may not really amount to much. But yes, there are good signs. So despite a 2.12% overall increase in the exports, let's also look at the fact the dollar itself has depreciated by 2.7%, right? So the earning generated by the exports in real terms has effectively decreased even in this year. But the good part of it is that the petroleum products share has been going down, which is primarily, both physically as well as figuratively a volatile commodity. And we saw this share jump up suddenly because of the Ukraine war in 2022. And the fact that these fluctuations have affected our export basket so much also shows that dependence on a source like this for exports is not really a great idea. Now, coming to the non-petroleum part of the exports, yes, 7% plus growth sounds good. And the fact that the composition of exports has also been changing is definitely a welcome sign. However, when I look at the past 5 years, then I don't see much of a composition change. If you look at the top 5 exports, it'll be chapter 27 of the HSN, chapter 84, 85, 87, and maybe a few other chapters. They still are at the top in terms of the export basket. Yes, quietly, as Mr. Ajay said, there has been a shift towards high technology items, computers and electronics. What I still look forward to is catching up in the high technology exports like the chip industry, which is around the corner, and these are big dollar games. The overall chip market across the world is expected to be about $500 billion almost. And I believe India's own consumption itself was close to $20 billion per annum and supposed to increase at a good CAGR. So that is one market in which we should have a say very soon. And I see that as a promise. We need to keep our eyes fixed in the future at the same time. Because the technology of today is not going to be the technology of tomorrow. So while investing in chips, we should also invest in quantum computing, which could be 10 years later on. You don't know what the world would look like in the world of technology. While investing in machinery, we should also look at green technologies because they will very soon outpace the other kinds of internal combustion engine and fossil fuel based technologies. So those are the few things that we need to keep in mind. And while looking at our export basket, let's be mindful that this year, China's export surplus itself is $1 trillion. So that's where we stand. And that also shows us the extent of the opportunity because $1 trillion of export surplus by one country is not a sustainable system. And it is already inviting reactions. We need to be a part of the game so that some of this surplus translates into opportunities for us.
Thank you for sharing that, Manasvi. Now let's hear from Mr. Ajay Sahai from a different perspective. Mr. Sahai, the world trade order is changing rapidly, and now with Donald Trump 2.0 soon to be a reality, how can Indian exporters best be supported to thrive?
In fact, with Mr. Trump coming in, we expect that at least geopolitically, world will be much more better place to live. The thing what we are witnessing, there are chances that ceasefire may happen. But with Mr. Trump, we will have huge uncertainty also. Every day, some new kinds of orders will throw. We are seeing extreme volatility in currency, which in our view is likely to accentuate with the tariff war starting. And at least in the first quarter of 2025, we expect the rupee may depreciate along with other emerging and developing economies. But on certain front, we hope that with Mr. Trump coming in, India will be a much better place to do business. We are seeing a lot of investment flowing to India. Probably the trend will continue. People will find out that this has not happened, and then the last occasion, investment has moved to Vietnam, but situation has changed. Today, Vietnam has an unemployment rate of 2%. We also feel that with high tariff coming on the electronics industry in China, some of that will move to Vietnam, and therefore Vietnam has to exit from many of the labor intensive sectors. We did an analysis and we observed that India can have an additional export of around $25 billion over and above the normal growth rate which we are witnessing. If we can bring our focus on US, there will be huge opportunity coming to India, though of course on number of fronts. We also have to negotiate with the US because Mr. Trump is a businessman. He will believe in give and take policy, but probably from the strategic point of view will be much better placed. Or some of the concern would be definitely on the oil prices because he will be harsh on both Russia and Iran. And with Russia and Iran to some extent cut off from the oil supply to the global market, the prices will move further. They have already moving further. So probably in the current scenario, I think while on the one hand, government can look into bilaterally negotiating with the US to get better market access from India and at the same time provide and address some of the concerns of the US, maybe on the tariff front, on the Harley Davidson, maybe on the market access, on the medical devices and instruments. Some of the low-hanging fruits needs to be looked into from the negotiation perspective. But overall, I think coming with Mr. Trump and with the tariff war escalating, it will be huge opportunity for India to chip in and a lot of businesses and investment will flow to India.
Okay. Ma'am, now coming to you. In terms of overall ease of doing business and compliance burden, what would you like the FIEO to announce this time for the exporting community?
We have made a lot of progress, and perhaps the reason is that we are signatories to the trade facilitation agreement, and in that process we've had proper um, uh, action plans which we have followed, and now we have TFA plus action points. So which is really very good that we have made such progress. And some of the good measures that we have taken are things like having mutual agreements on authorized economic operators. And we have this agreement with UAE, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, USA, UAE, and many others, and we're in the process of including even more. Um, but while the TFA takes care of all of these, I think what is really important for India is inland haulage, and that is a huge part of our transaction cost because we're a large country, and inputs and finished goods are moving in and out of various cities and various ports within the country. So that's why the logistics becomes very important. So while we do have PM Gati Shakti as a very important initiative, which is highly institutionalized and is delivering results, with technology being a key component of how this could pan out. Um, I think where we lag behind is taking forward the logistic policy, because even though it's an excellent document, uh, it doesn't have that kind of an institutionalizing that in Gati Shakti has. So if that were to work in tandem with Gati Shakti, I think we would address a lot of our trade facilitation problems. Uh, Another good development has been the account aggregator framework, because this is really going to help SMEs uh, in how the account aggregator framework brings together the borrowers and the lenders, and uh, I think that's a very big change, and it would be interesting to see state finance get built into the system, because that's a very good way of making our exports competitive if we have good terms of reference for trade finance. Let's take the example of China. Even though unit prices of imports from China for several items are higher than other competitors, we're still importing from China. And the main reason is that the Chinese exporters get very favorable terms on trade finance. So if a firm is importing from China, they're allowed deferred payments, and all the payments are backloaded. So that gives them, they would prefer to import from China at a higher price than from other competitors, because of a lower cost of finance. So that, I think, and the last point to make on facilitation is that we're ignoring investment facility. That's extremely important because we still have our bilateral investment treaties hanging in the air. We need to finalize them. As of now, we only have 4 or 5 bilateral investment treaties that are in operation. So we need to go ahead with that as well, because that's going to be key in determining foreign direct investment into the country.
Okay. Now over to Mr. Srivastava. So India's export basket has traditionally been more or less the same, with some shifts seen recently. In your view, what specific measures should this budget contain to make our export basket more future ready?
Two things. One, we need to work on the fundamental reforms. For example, our cost of production is high compared to China or Vietnam and many other countries. Our, say, lending rates, specifics, if I want to go, lending rates are higher than China. Then power is not uninterrupted all the time and the costs are higher. Then logistics cost is higher compared to China and Vietnam both. All these make the overall product cost high compared to these countries with which we intend to compete. And if I give you one example of all these is that if I want to make a solar cell in India, the cost will be more than 40% higher than China because of all these factors. I'm ignoring the technology part altogether. So first is budget. This budget, next budget, all the future budgets should focus on making India a low cost production economy. Our cost of production should come down. That's number one. Number two, I say, let's take the example of smartphone. It's the greatest Make in India success story for us so far. The best PLI example, success story for this. And this has been possible because of a combination of, say, incentives through PLIs and tariff arbitrage, that we set some tariffs on components and higher tariffs on uh, smartphones finished product. We should not disturb this. If some policy is paying you from $0 to $16 billion annual exports are there for smartphones, it has paid us handsomely. We should not disturb. For example, some associations are saying make the smartphone component tariffs zero. Then today, if import contents are 70%, they will go to 100%. What we gain? We don't gain anything. So my request is, if some policy is paying handsomely, please retain that policy for few years. These two. Thanks.
So, Mr. Manasvi, India's share in global trade is still set to be under its true potential. What specific measures this budget should announce to change this? For example, in terms of technology upgradation, workers' skill set, quality control, and making goods globally competitive.
But primarily, I would say that we need not anymore depend upon devaluation to drive our exports. So the word quality control that you mentioned is very apt in that we need a quality revolution in this country, and there would need to be incentives similar to the incentives crafted out under PLI. If some schemes are made out which reward quality production in India, I think they would be of some use. I do not have exactly the contours of such a scheme in mind, but I would think that that is very much needed. The second thing, which, as Dr. Ajay Srivastava mentioned, is that if something has worked for us, let's retain that, the tariff arbitrage plus the PLIs, because PLIs in some sectors have given dividends, but let's also be honest, in many other sectors it hasn't. There have been large amounts of funds which have been lying in wait for PLI, and there have been almost no claimants for it. So the government needs to look at this, I would say, the software of trade, which is primarily the regulatory and the judicial aspect of trade. No. And when I say trade, primarily trade is driven by investment. As Dr. Taneja mentioned, that we should not shy off from inviting FDI, but it's one thing to invite, it's quite another to welcome by acts. And a welcome by action would be when we make doing business in India actually good, not in terms of ranking, but in terms of the regulatory, administrative, and judicial complexity, reducing the three. And I would stress on all of these three. Very often, you hear the words regulatory complexity without elaborating on what does it mean. Regulatory complexity in terms of setting up a business, discharging your tax and trade obligations, administrative complexity in terms of the administration not taking arbitrary decisions, and judicial complexity, finally, in terms of interpreting and giving rational decisions. Today, if you look at the landscape of tax and trade decisions in India, some decisions would be good, but there are many decisions, right up to the highest court of the land, sorry to say, which completely detract from the international logic on known issues. You'll have immense examples on valuation and classification, where there are judgments which is very difficult to decipher as to where does it really come from. And this is what scares away investment in India, because people are not sure that if they put in money to manufactured stuff, is that investment secure? Will that investment really be there for the long term? And and then finally, I would say, keeping an eye on the future, distinctly emerging technologies which need to be encouraged. One point which probably I probably omitted mentioning earlier, and others did, was the services sector. In the services sector, it's fine to talk about GCCs, it's fine to talk about the IT and IT-enabled services. Let's be mindful of the fact that in the new world order with AI and robotics, both IT-enabled services as well as manufacturing employment could be under challenge. Therefore, this budget should look at, what should we do in this direction? And one sector that comes to my mind topmost, where humans are probably irreplaceable, is tourism. Tourism-based services in India have immense potential, and I would say vastly untapped potential. Even a small country like UAE probably gets multiples of the tourists that India gets. And why is it so? I would say this again translates down to the governance coefficient, the governance quotient. If we are able to ensure safety, security, and hygiene, there's no reason why the diverse heritage of this country cannot be marketed enough to compensate for most other services sectors. So these are the few things that come to my mind. And in terms of compliance and regulation, also I've mentioned that regulatory, administrative, and judicial complexity need to be reduced. Please do remind me if I've missed out some of your basic part of the question. I might have, because of my rambling narrative.
Thank you, Manasvi, for your insights. You raised some crucial points. Appreciate that. Mr. Sahai, any specific recommendations from your side to the FM to help the countries exporting MSMEs?
I think we would be very happy if the flow of credit to the export sector can be increased. In fact, in last 2 years, if I'm looking to financial year 22, 23, 23, 24, in last 2 years, export in rupee term has gone up by 50%. Flow of credit to export is dropped by 5%. So the gap has definitely now enlarged between the flow of credit. Export is, of course, under the priority sector lending. But if you look into the priority sector lending also flow, in the last 2 years, from 21, 22 to 23, 24, it has come down from 19,861 crore to 11,720 crore. That is 46% drop. Because there is no sub-target fixed for the export sector. We know that, of course, it's part of the RBI, not for the FM. But as a general rule, we have to look into increasing the liquidity, both for the export sector as well as for the domestic market also. Secondly, the cost of credit, which Ajay has raised, is extremely important for export, because in exports, it's the global competitiveness, and our cost of credit is pretty high. And for export, the interest equalization scheme was there. The scheme has not been extended beyond 31st of December. There are a lot of concerns because many of the SMEs who are now executing the order in very rapid thin margins, probably those orders may move from India to the rest of the country. Thirdly, I think we have to bring focus on R&D. People have talked about technology, about the innovation, but our R&D spending is one of the lowest in the world. We are not spending even 1% of the GDP on R&D. R&D globally has been incentivized. If you look into 35 out of 38 OECD countries, they have either provided tax deduction or tax incentive. In India, we used to have 200% reduction on R&D. It has come down to 100% now. That means as good as a business expenses. We would like FM that at least for the R&D, a tax deduction of 200 to 300% to be provided, because it's at a huge gestation period with a lot of uncertainty. And finally, we would like India to be Atmanirbhar even in the area of shipping. We want an Indian shipping line of global repute that may require providing infrastructure status of shipping. That needs to be looked into, because if you look into container manufacturing, with the container manufacturing starting in India, the container prices have stabilized into the country. The same is likely to happen when we have our own shipping line, and that gets a major share. Let us say they get 25% shares. Besides saving around $25 to $30 billion annually on the transport remittances, we can be in a position where we can negotiate with the foreign shipping lines also.
Okay. Mr. Ajay Srivastava, the same question for you, building on what Mr. Sahai's take on exporting MSMEs. Would you like to add anything further?
Yes, so I'll talk about totally different things. So I would, many policies are announced by specific administrative ministries, but their effects they cut across the sectors. So I want certain schemes to be studied in the context of MSMEs, their impact. For example, QCOs. QCO has been implemented for shoes and leather items. Will it amount to shifting of business from small and cottage industries to big players? That will hurt the MSME. We should study that. Second, machine regulations. Ministry of Heavy Industries, they say within 1 year's time, MSMEs and other large firms also, they have to change their production system to conform to their machine regulations. This is not going to be there. It will hurt the MSMEs. It needs to be studied. Otherwise, it will hurt MSMEs in a long term. Then NOC system followed by the Steel Ministry. It's not the policy, it's not the procedure. It's simply a barrier which is choking imports and preventing the supplies of raw materials, imported raw material to the MSMEs. Many of them, they are starving of raw materials. All these things are hurting the MSMEs. And then finally, inverted duty structure. When our finished product which I'm making is available at the cost which is lower than my raw material cost, I can never make in India. So there are more than 20 specific examples of inverted duty structure. Budget team should study all these four things in the context of MSMEs and maybe come out with a appropriate solution. Thank you.
Sure. So, and ma'am, in terms of India's FTAs or other trade agreements, do you have any specific recommendations this time?
I would classify our new FTAs that we have signed as somewhat weak FTAs because I think what's happening is that most of the focus is really on tariff negotiations, and we spend so much, and the tariffs are already low in most of these countries, whether it is UAE or the EFTA countries. Uh, so we're not really getting anything out of it. But what we should be working on is better market access. Whether we have an FTA with the country or not, we should be preparing ourselves better to access these markets. And I take a cue from what Manasvi said, that it has to be our quality so that we're able to cater to different markets. And it's not just quality, it's also meeting differing regulatory requirements in different markets. EU has a different set of regulations. US has a different set of regulations. Now we want to expand to the developing countries. If we expand to the developing countries, it doesn't mean that the standards are lower. It means that they are different from the developed countries. And we need to cater to all of these markets. And so it's not only about getting information on what requirements are of these different markets, but also in markets. And here, I think this is where the budgetary allocation comes in. What we can do is we have something called the market assistance initiative scheme floated by the Ministry of Commerce, and there's about 200 crores per year that's allocated in it. That should be increased to at least 5 times more. And what we are doing right now is basically supporting events abroad. And there is a very small amount that is kept for services, for instance, and a very small amount kept for all sectors, because a large part of it, almost 33%, is used by the textile sector. So it's also, unequal in its allocation. Maybe the demand for it is a lot more from the apparel sector, but apparel exports haven't done really well. So rather than focusing so much on events, maybe there are other activities that we can bring in. And one of these could be reimbursement for meeting statutory compliances. I think that would be a big help for the exporters, because it will help them build their capacity to meet the requirements of foreign markets. So that, I think, is something that the government can do. And also, I think in terms of creating an enabling environment. And if I look at a bottoms up approach, then maybe it's skill development, which is going to lie at the core, because manufacturing is changing in terms of its technology component. Services are in any case technology driven. So, what we need to look at is a completely new workforce, and how do we prepare this workforce. So a lot of investment should go into skill development to prepare this new generation skill set that can actually deliver both goods and services. So and that I would go a step further and say, therefore, the allocation for health and education should increase, because that's how you will get an available pool that can be trained. So I think we focused a lot on infrastructure, which was needed, but I think now we need to focus more on the human infrastructure or the social infrastructure.
Mr. Manasvi, ma'am talked about the incentives needed to push Make in India and all those Atmanirbhar Bharat initiatives and how to push manufacturing here in India. According to you, what incentives and SOPs are needed to push these agendas, domestic manufacturing agendas of the country?
Well, firstly, when we say incentives, I would understand that everybody on this panel knows that export incentives is not a good word in international trade. So we have to stay away from the export incentives relating to goods, and which is where the manufacturing incentives that you talk about, they become relevant. It's important to understand as to why have there been less PLI takers for the sectors in which the offtake has not been very good. You know, and I would not sit in judgment over how the government would have dealt with it, but the government definitely needs to sit back and analyze why, except for some smartphones and a few other such products, things did take off. But why, except for them, in the other sectors, it did not make much of a dent? Is it that your regulatory complexity and the other stuff that you needed to do is still work in progress, and therefore people may not have that much confidence? The second thing that I would add on to Dr. Taneja is that yes, health and education are focus areas for investment. What is also needed, I would say, on the expenditure side in the current budget is expenditure on building the infrastructure for tourism. I've already mentioned it earlier, and I would think that this is something which is a long-term play. There was a time when we had sudden offtake of BPO services, KPO services. Today, probably the KPO services are now going under a new name called GCCs. But with the changes in technologies, we have to keep in mind that given our large population, we have to encourage manufacturing and services which have a large human component. And that's what we probably need to do. But coming back to your Make in India, I would list a few things like deep analysis of why the policies have not worked, where they've not worked, extending the things that have worked to certain other sectors. For example, it is possible that where you gave PLI incentives, you did not have the same tariff arbitrage that you had in smartphones and components. So can you now in the new world have tariff arbitrage? Thirdly, also keeping in mind the dynamic nature of the world that we live in, which is going to become extremely dynamic once the Trump administration takes over. When you're playing football in the field, it's best to be on the side of the bully and make friends with the bully. So, which is the reality of the situation. It is also likely that India may not be in the crosshairs of the new administration because we are not amongst the top 10 exporters to the US. So let us identify those products and try to make them in India and see whether our PLI policies cater to that. Still, another point that I'd like to make, don't know whether it is related exactly to your question or not, but on the overall exports is how do we diversify the destination countries of our exports? Let us not be completely dependent and immediately razor focused on US because they are the largest consumer of our export products. Let us diversify as much as possible so that the risk is reduced. And finally, I would make a recommendation to the finance minister in this budget to, in addition to the expenditure side commitments that they may make on various sectors, including tourism and green energy and skilling and healthcare. In addition to that, one particular very specific request on reducing regulatory complexities, please make the system of advance rulings more prevalent. advanced ruling is a system in which there is a body which can give an interpretation of the law given the particular situation that is put before it. Please make that more relevant and please reduce it, take it away from judicial challenges so that there is more and more predictability of any investment into India. I think if this feature is taken care of, a large problem would be solved.
Okay. Okay. Now coming to the last question, which I would take to each of you. Mr. Sai, what would be your top three key budget wish list items, if I may call it?
In fact, I've already illustrated one. I'm looking into the issues relating to liquidity, which is flow of credit, the cost of credit, collateral-free lending for the SMEs. The other, I would be focusing on the marketing. The marketing fund which is available is grossly inadequate. We are looking into an export of $1 trillion of goods, $1 trillion of export of services with a corpus of 200 crore, which will not lead us to anywhere. The need of the hour is to showcase the Indian product and services to the global audience. That needs to happen. And finally, we have to work on the infrastructure and logistics. This is something which is happening, but probably the pace has to be accelerated in the union budget.
Ma'am, your take on this?
Uh, so basically, I think more a greater budgetary allocation for health and education and skill development, more money set aside for meeting statutory compliances, which would really mean reimbursement of expenses that are incurred by firms to meet uh, standard requirements abroad. And the third thing would be, I don't know whether it would be related to the budget or how it would be kind of done, is to actually come up with something like a trade barrier report that the US brings out. The USTR brings out an annual trade barrier report, and it tells you about barriers in each and every market. So any exporter who's looking at that knows what the barrier in every country is. So that also helps us to diversify into different markets. And if we could prepare our own report along those lines, maybe in collaboration with the US, which the government could do, I think that would help our exporters a lot, both in expanding and diversifying.
All right. Mr. Ajay Srivastava, yes, your take.
Yes, sir. I have not three, but only one big thing. So I want finance minister to look at import duties in entirely different lights. Initially, a few years back, say 10 years, 20 years back, it was a major source of revenue when tariffs were 50%, 100%. Now, custom duties, they account for only 6.4% of tax collected, only 6.4%. So it's no more a revenue source. So why not tweak the entire structure from the point of view of feeding to the Make in India policy, which means you lower the tariffs on the raw materials, make the intermediate level, and higher duties on the finished goods, and remove inverted duty structures. So many changes are needed, and if they are cleverly done, government will not be losing any revenue, but it will be serving the Make in India cause in a big way. So I say change the way we look at the tariffs, not as a revenue source, but as a active instrument to support the Make in India. Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Manasvi, what would you like to add here?
Okay. So the 3 points could be 3.5 actually. The first point that I mentioned was, can advanced rulings be made more strong, and the legal infrastructure, the regulations and the law for the same to be strengthened. The second point, the rather 1.5 point, is reduce litigation. How can we reduce as much litigation as possible on imports and GST? Because they consume a lot of time and they scare away a lot of investors. That's the first point. The second is on the expenditure side, handsome allocation for green energy and tourism sector. And thirdly, the third point is, of course, more policy rather than for the budget. How can they incentivize the service sector? Because let's realize that the on export subsidies pertain to goods. Challenges on services, they're not built into the WTO legal structure. So you can still incentivize some services and find creative ways of doing it so that even in future they may sustain some regulatory challenge internationally. These are the three things on my wish list.
Thanks everyone for such a thought-provoking discussion. As we stand at the cusp of a new budget, it is our hope that the ideas and concerns shared today find their way into the policymakers' agenda. Thanks a lot, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.
Very much.